Hello, I'm Declan Carey, and this is the Redaction Politics Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be updating you on the US election, which is now 36 days away. We're also going to be talking about the Labour Party, which has a narrow lead over the Conservative Party for the first time since Boris Johnson became Tory leader. Later on, we're going to look at regional government around the UK and how that could be better. And we're going to take a look at eco-fascism and the impact it's had on the world. Now, it's been a couple of weeks since we last met, and a lot has changed, especially in the US, not least the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which has had a big impact on the country and the election. Richard, how big of an impact will Ruth's death be?
Well, I think it's going to be huge, to be honest. It's interesting to see how little the race has changed in terms of the polls. Just to start with, in the first 2 weeks, in the last 2 weeks, everything has remained largely stable. The lead that Biden has over Trump has remained largely the same as is his lead in certain battleground states. But yeah, you're right. So the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg has the ability to change this race quite fundamentally. So for those of us who aren't aware of how the kind of the system works in the US. The Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. Well, they can retire or they can die. And what happens is that a president will nominate a justice to be put on the Supreme Court, and that justice must be confirmed by the Senate just by a simple majority, 51 votes, and then they're put on the bench for life. So the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died has now given Trump the opportunity to nominate a third justice in his term, which is pretty unheard of. If he gets this new justice confirmed, it'll mean that the court will move quite significantly to the right, and it will remain there for almost a generation. All three of his justices, or the justices that he nominated, are on the younger side. I think they're all under 50, actually, with the possible exception of Gorsuch.
Gorsuch was under 50 when he was nominated. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're certainly not long in the tooth by any judicial standard. And what the issue is, in the last year of Obama's presidency, a similar thing happened. Justice Scalia died, and Obama duly nominated somebody called Merrick Garland, and the Senate said, absolutely not. We're not having a vote on him because it's a presidential election year. Well, you can fast forward 4 years, and a similar thing has happened. And what do you think the Senate is saying? Come on, let's have a vote. We want to get this guy confirmed, or this girl confirmed, as quickly as we possibly can. It's interesting as well because I've been thinking a lot about it, and there are advantages and disadvantages to this. At the moment, the Republicans are saying we need to push through this confirmation process as quickly as we possibly can, almost in a kind of, we know we're going to lose in November and we need to change as much as we can before we're out of power. But I'm a little bit wary about what might happen to the motivation for Republican voters. When Trump was running in 2016, a lot of evangelical voters were unsure of him, and largely because of the crass comments that he's made in his lifestyle in general, and the fact that he's probably of no religion himself. But he then did say, right, okay, I'm going to nominate a number of these justices, a number of these conservative justices, and it sort of swung their vote. Now, if he confirms this third conservative justice, the evangelicals have got their wish. They've got 3 right-wing justices on the court, and they may not be as motivated to turn up in November. So I think it remains to be seen, but I think there are risks for this to happen. I think in terms of the votes, it's unlikely that the Democrats are going to be able to get anything, going to be able to stop this. The Republicans have quite a sizable majority, 53-47 in the Senate. 2 senators have come out and said that they won't support a vote until after the presidential election, but only 2. So that doesn't matter. So at this stage, the Republicans look like they have the numbers to get this through. So barring any kind of massive scandal, something about this justice that we don't know about, I can see this as being quite a smooth confirmation process, and Amy Coney Barrett will be on the Supreme Court by election day, in my humble opinion.
Yes, of the initials ACB rather than ACAB.
Indeed.
But who would have thought it that Mitch McConnell would be such a shameless hypocrite? Who would have thought it?
Who would have thought? If anything, if you've got to look historically. McConnell was a big part of the nomination of a guy called Robert Bork in 1987. And Robert Bork was nominated to the Supreme Court by then President Ronald Reagan. And the Democrats were able to block his nomination. And it seems like he has a long memory, does Mitch McConnell, because now he's doing everything he can to get back at the Democrats, having been able to successfully block Merrick Garland, and now to add another 3 justices to the Supreme Court. It's also going to be interesting to see what the Democrats do if they do indeed win the presidency and the Senate. There's some talk about them increasing the number of seats on the Supreme Court. There's nothing in the Constitution that states that there has to be 9. In fact, there have been periods in the Republic where there have been less than 9, and periods where there have been more than 9. So there's every chance that they may increase that number by 4 or 5. They might also try to get DC and Puerto Rico statehood, which would give another 4, which would mean there would be another 4 Senate seats, because each state has 2 senators, no matter how big or how small they are. And another interesting thing that I read this week is that there's been a call to break California up into 5 different states. Wow. To reflect its massively diverse background. At which point you would obviously have another, if there were 5 states of California, there'd be 10 senators rather than 2. So the political games will continue to play out through the election and beyond.
Yes, but before we go a bit further into this, let me just, for the benefit of our listeners on the podcast, just introduce who our guests are, of course. Of course, we've got James Moules, our contributing editor, and Mason Quah and Richard Hansen, our reporters. On this issue, I mean, how significant could this be on the result of the election? Let's say Trump loses and we have a majority Conservative Supreme Court. Is there any way that we can see some problems with that if Trump refuses to leave the White House? James?
Well, let's be clear, there already is a Conservative majority on the court. It's 5-4 already. And this would massively reshape the court and realign it towards the Conservatives if Trump's nominee is approved. The big fear, of course, is if we're seeing a Bush v. Gore style scenario with the Florida recount, and just how much such a Conservative court could affect the election, potentially in Trump's favor. Obviously, as I mentioned in the previous episode of this podcast, the Supreme Court at the moment hasn't necessarily been so favorable to Trump. I mean, Neil Gorsuch voted against Trump on the transgender legislation. So having this extra justice in his pocket against someone as liberal as Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of the most stalwart liberals on the court, is obviously going to be a massive bonus to Trump.
It's worrying. I've written a couple of pieces for Redaction Politics in the last few weeks about this sort of situation. I think it depends how the election takes shape, but there are some seriously frightening scenarios that might occur if this election is very close. And I don't mean frightening in that Trump will be given 4 more years. In fact, that would be quite simple in comparison to a number of these situations. The Supreme Court doesn't always weigh in on these issues. The reason why they weighed in 2000 is because there was a recount going on in Florida, and they ruled that the state of Florida's Supreme Court had overstepped its purview in making sure that recount continued. I think what's more terrifying is there's a situation brewing in Pennsylvania whereby there is a Democratic governor, but there's also a Republican-led legislature. And Pennsylvania, as we know, is a swing state. It went for Donald Trump in 2016, went red in 2016 for the first time in quite some time. And there's also every chance that Donald Trump will appear to have pulled ahead on election night. But as the postal votes come in over the next few days, it's more than likely that Joe Biden will regain that lead. But there's also every chance that the Democratic governor could certify Biden as the winner, and the Republican legislature could certify Trump as the winner. What would happen then is that the Electoral College, the 20 electoral votes of Pennsylvania, those are actual people that come to Washington and physically cast a ballot. And it depends on who wins that state, whether those 20 people are 20 Democrats or 20 Republicans. Now, there's every chance that 20 Democrats and 20 Republicans could be sent to Washington on December the 14th. And that would be almost an unheard of situation whereby the Senate would have to decide what to do. The Senate being the Republicans being in control of the Senate. Mike Pence could decide, the vice president, as president of the Senate, could decide, well, I'm only going to count the Republican electors, or he could say, well, there's Democratic electors and Republican electors, so I'm going to cancel that out, and I'm not going to count Pennsylvania's votes at all. And the election could hinge on Pennsylvania. Nate Silver of 538.com believes that Pennsylvania will be the tipping point state. The 270th electoral vote will come from Pennsylvania. So, and all the while there will be protest after protest, violence after violence situation on both the red side and the blue side. So, and meanwhile you've got Supreme Court. They may be asked to weigh in on it, and there will be a conservative majority on that court with or without this new nomination. So I really genuinely am fearful for what's going to happen in the next 6 or so weeks.
Yes, it's certainly going to be an interesting time. And one thing that we've got to look forward to is going to be live debates between Trump and Biden. I've already been reading a little bit about that, and reports are coming out that Trump is going to go blisteringly personal, which...
Well, what do we expect?
Yeah, I think not many people will be surprised by that. Mason, how do you think Joe Biden would fare in a live debate against Trump?
I think he's going to fare poorly, unless they put him on like whatever it was he was high on when he was debating Bernie. He's not going to do well against Trump. And even then, it's going to be like that. Means that like in that situation, we've got one good performance out of Sleepy Joe, and then he crawls back to his cave for a couple of months, which isn't an ideal situation either. I don't think he's going to perform well in live debates. I think it'll be very entertaining just to watch the two of them slug at each other, but I don't think that it's going to be a good look for the Democrats.
I think it's a case of lowering expectations on the Democrats' side, and I think we're doing a good job of doing that in this podcast now. But I think the question that really needs to be asked is, never mind the debate shenanigans, never mind the slugging at each other. Is this going to move the needle? Is this going to convince people to change their mind, or in fact to convince them to vote for one or the other? Nothing in this electoral race really in the last year has moved the needle significantly, and I would be very surprised if the debate does so. Historically, sitting presidents fare badly in the first debate because for the first time in 4 years there's somebody standing on the podium next to them as basically an equal. And they don't prepare, and they think, who is this upstart coming in? I'm the president of the United States. How dare you?
Yes, they don't have to do PMQs in the States.
No, exactly. They don't have to justify themselves on a regular basis. So I agree with you, Mason. I think Biden is going to struggle with Trump's chaotic approach, but I think it remains to be seen whether that does move the needle.
Well, I think that's the point. I think we saw that in 2016 as well. With those Clinton versus Trump debates, I don't think they would have changed very much, because those two candidates were playing to massively different audiences. Mm-hmm. To a Clinton supporter who already had their mind made up, Clinton would have clearly won those debates. To a Trump supporter, Trump would have done. I don't think there was much in any of those three debates that would have swung people either way.
No, the only thing that I might that might help swing the needle further in the Democrats' favor is actually the fact that Kamala Harris is on the Senate Judiciary Committee, so she will be front and center in this Supreme Court confirmation. She'll have a lot of free airtime to talk to this to talk to Judge Barnett. So that may help, because obviously she is a prosecutor by nature. She may be able to change some minds, but I think the debate itself is going to be a largely do no harm, no foul situation, unless Trump or Biden do something. Even if they do something major, I just can't see the undecideds changing.
I think if Biden does manage to pull something major off, manage to get some sort of proper flustered response from Trump that makes him look poorly, I do think that would have some effect, because there's a large amount of Trump's base that follow him because they see him as the strong figure, that he is the strong man. Yes. If that gets undermined in the debates, which I don't know if Biden is capable of doing, then that would weaken him.
Like what's Trump going to say then? I was unfairly treated. The moderator was on Biden's side. That's what we're going to hear.
Yeah, like last time, Hillary was given the questions in advance, is what he said last time. And also, I think it was it the second debate that happened immediately after the Access Hollywood tape?
Correct, yeah.
Which didn't derail his campaign, and in my humble opinion, very much should have. We spoke about this on the podcast 2 weeks ago, that the best way to defeat Trump is to talk about Trump and his character failings rather than to talk about policy. So I think if Trump is going to go blisteringly personal to Biden, I think that's probably going to play into Biden's hands, because it will allow Biden to talk about Trump as a person. And you never know, there could be something outrageous. They could, Joe Biden could say, President Trump, you say that you weigh 270 pounds or however much it is, 240 pounds. I've bought a scale. Would you like to step on it? There's anything is possible. He could bring his tax returns along. It's entirely. He could ask him how much money he's earned in the last year. He could call him poor. I think yeah, you're right. A lot of Trump supporters see him as the strong man, and Trump certainly doesn't want to be seen as poor and fat and all of these things that he so holds dear.
And one thing to bear in mind with Trump's sexual assault allegations and the Hollywood tape is that Clinton had no moral authority in which to attack Trump on that.
No,
because all Trump had to do is bring out Bill Clinton's accusees. It'll be the same with Biden. Let's not forget that Biden stands accused of sexual assault himself. He
does. He stands accused of sexual assault, but I would, that whether or not those accusations are substantiated is another question. But yeah, you're right. It's very easy to turn the mirror around.
Yeah, the allegation sometimes is enough, isn't it, in these debates? Of course, one thing to look forward to is Trump's announcement that if he does lose to Joe Biden, that he will simply vanish and disappear, and we'll never see him again. Do we want to hold him to his word on that? Do we think he will?
How can we?
It depends again on the results themselves. But like I wrote in an article recently for you guys, there's a group of people called the Transition Integrity Project, who were a group of Republicans and Democrats who kind of gamed out specific scenarios of the election and what is likely to happen. And anything other than a Biden landslide is likely to lead to Trump not conceding and also violence on the streets. I think the best we can hope for is a kind of negotiated settlement. You might find that if Biden wins the Electoral College by a small margin, say he's less than 300 but more than 270, Trump might say, right, I'm going to concede, but you have to pardon these people. You have to promise that you're not going to prosecute me. I think it's important to remember that Trump will be in trouble with the law once he stops being president, and I think that's his primary goal to becoming reelected.
Of course, Trump's recently also come out. I'm interested to hear what you guys think on this. Is Trump going to go after Biden on his race record? Because Trump has just announced this platinum plan for African Americans. He's promising 3 million new jobs. He's promising 500,000 black-owned businesses if he's reelected. And of course, one major attack line that got wheeled out the instant Kamala Harris was announced as the vice presidential nominee for the Democrats was when Kamala Harris went after Joe Biden during the Democratic primary debates on his race record. And he's just going to reel out this attack line of, well, if his own vice presidential nominee doesn't have faith in his race record, why should you?
Well, it's a demographic that perhaps he could look to regain some support on. Trump is losing support of women. He's also losing support of suburban voters. I talked briefly about the fact that he's not doing terribly with the Latino vote, but there's complications surrounding that as well. So yeah, it might be electorally intelligent to do that.
I mean, look, Trump doesn't need African American voters to vote for him. He just needs them not to vote for Biden.
Just needs them to stay home. That's right. And he needs them it to be as difficult as possible to cast your vote, and that's why we're seeing talk of militias manning polling stations, ensuring that the vote is fair, and all of this kind of thing. Yeah, you're right. He needs to suppress the vote as much as he can. That gives him the best shot at victory.
I mean, we've all seen the clips of, those armed men in military-style gear, but do we know who they're actually affiliated with? Are they going to be walking around on polling day? Are they going to be on the prowl?
Are they going to be walking around after polling day as well, which is, while the votes are being counted, trying to stop things from being counted in a complete way? I think from a purely non-partisan perspective, I think it's vital that as many votes can be counted as humanly possible. Just the world is watching America. America for so many years has been the bastion of democracy and freedom, and everywhere around the world. This is why we're talking about this as a bunch of, what was the Reddit comment from the week? This is just a bunch of British people talking about what they've seen on the internet. Well, I'll have you know, I'm from New Zealand, but
plus, isn't the internet where most Americans get their news from anyway?
Well, quite, but Americans are more than welcome on this podcast. In fact,
that's true. They are more than welcome.
I mean, I would love, if you're out there and you're a Trump supporter, I would love to have you on, and I mean that absolutely genuinely. This is a firm invitation to have a chat about why you think the way you think and what you think is going to happen.
Mr. Shapiro, if you're listening.
Yeah. Similarly, I know personally at least perhaps more than 2 American people who listen to this because they are my close friends. And if they're listening, I would also like to hear you on at some time. We need more left-right libertarian unity.
Absolutely right.
You know who you are.
Without question.
Yes. And of course, keep the comments coming in, because although perhaps we don't like all the comments, we definitely like to see them. And it's nice that people engage in what we're saying. So definitely keep them coming in.
What you wish for there, Declan?
Asking for people to comment on the internet is always a dangerous game. I mean, on that note, just before we move on to the next part, I'm gonna ask Mason a question here, because Richard mentioned the impact that might have on the world if we do see perhaps militia style situation after the election, depending on what the result is, of course. But Mason, if there is some irregularities, if there is a legal challenge, a legal battle, if we do see soldiers on the streets in America, how does the rest of the world react to that?
I mean, I think the same way the rest of the world reacts whenever America does something terrible to their own people. We'll all sort of tut passive aggressively and then carry on trading with them.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I think there's been a lot has happened in the last 4 years, and the world's expectations have diminished as far as America's ability to govern itself in a way. So, I think, when we all woke up on November the 9th, 2016, a great proportion of us were surprised to see Trump win, but I think now if Trump does win, or if there is something close, or there's some irregularities, or there's militia on the streets, I think more people in the world won't be surprised as they would have been 4 years ago.
Oh, I was up all night watching the 2016 election live. Dare I rub my own crystal ball in hindsight? I was one of the few people who did predict that Trump might win, but it was a weird experience being there live watching it, because this was in Britain, let's bear in mind, and there were people with MAGA hats and US flag capes in this bar where I was watching it. It was a weird experience.
I'd like to describe it as a train crash happening incredibly slowly, but there's absolutely nothing that you can do about it. Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good time to plug another live event, which Redaction Politics are in the process of organising. When the American election does happen on Tuesday, November 3rd, we will be live streaming the event with everybody who's currently here, plus more from the Redaction team. So if there is another train crash and you would like to watch us react to that train crash, then that's the place to be. But on an important note as well, we will be fundraising for the wonderful charity Safe Passage, who offer support to unaccompanied children who are refugees arriving in destination countries like the UK. We'll definitely be sharing all this in our links and comments, so please do have a look there. And of course, please come and join us on November 3rd. It's going to be, I think, an exciting night, no matter which way it goes.
And please donate.
Yes, of course.
Most critically of all.
Absolutely. Anything you can spare would be great. There'll be a link below to the Just Giving page that we've set up. And yeah, we'll be live all night. Who knows when this podcast will finish on Wednesday, November the 4th. There's every chance that there'll be some outstanding results, but you can guarantee that there'll definitely be some tension and expectation and drama.
And November the 4th is my birthday, so you better tune in for
Although,
that.
because not all the votes will be counted by the 4th. This does raise the question: are we going to continuously podcast for an entire week while all the mail-ins are counted?
Well, my wife is due to have a baby later that week, so I fear that I will be bowing out at some point in that week. But there will certainly be plenty of information for us to be talking about as the votes are counted. Yeah,
Indeed.
It's going to turn out to a complete anticlimax now, and there is a clear winner on the night.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because we are talking about so much of it being disputed. 4 years ago, we were saying, by how many hundred electoral votes is Hillary Clinton going to win this by?
Well, yeah.
So and a bit like the general election of this country, of the UK in 2019, people were thinking, oh, will Boris get his majority? Will he not? Will there be a hung parliament? Will Corbyn be able to cobble together with some of the other minor parties? Will he not? And then 10 p.m. rolled around and he was forecasted to have 360 plus seats, and we were like, oh, great, okay, well, that's the end of the drama. So surprise is the order of the night.
I think one of the cases with the 2019 election, though, was that everyone was so used to mistrusting the polls. I mean,
yes,
the result we got was exactly what the polls said was going to happen. But people were saying, oh, no, maybe there'll be some larger margin of error than we're expecting. And no.
And if that holds true in the US, if somebody like Nate Silver is to be believed, then Biden will have 350 or so electoral votes and Trump will have 180 or so electoral votes. And you never know, but we're not very trusting of pollsters and polls, are we?
I think there is an element of selective reporting going on when people say the polls are always wrong. But yeah, I mean, don't take polls at face value, and don't, as we're about to come on to, don't place too much significance on one particular poll. On that note, did anyone see the recent opinion poll?
I did. I also saw the journalist. Well, sorry, the guy, not journalist, the guy who worked for Opinion, tweet yesterday morning with an emoji of a brain explosion. So we all knew that something was about to drop on Saturday night. It's heartening to see Labour getting into a stronger position. But I don't know what you guys think. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but if you translate that 3-point advantage, it's only one poll, it could be an outlier, but if you translate that 3-point advantage, it only translates into 285 seats for Labour and 260 seats for the Conservatives. It doesn't translate into an overall majority, not by a long shot. And as a result, I think it's indicative of our electoral system and how difficult it is for left-wing progressive parties to get into government and to actually be able to change things rather than to just crow from the outside.
Well, one of the things that massively changed for Labour was how dominant the SNP now is in Scotland, which used to be critical for Labour if they wanted to get a majority government, having the Scottish vote. And now that seems to be a closed avenue. I mean, Scottish Labour has been a largely ineffectual force for quite a while now, whoever the leader's been. I know a lot of people are blaming Richard Leonard at the moment and saying it's proof that his left-wing leadership is poor. I mean, we've had leaders from all over the Labour spectrum in Scottish Labour recent years. They've all done poorly. It goes deeper than who's the leader.
I'd like to know what you guys think about this, but I personally think Keir Starmer would do well by offering an olive branch to the SNP, because I think at least in the short or medium term, it's his clearest way back to power.
Well, we've already seen that. He's refused to rule out opposing IndyRef 2, I think I saw recently.
Correct. Yep.
So he's clearly gearing up for the possibility that he'll need to cobble together a deal with the SNP in 2024, assuming he does well enough to be the largest party in the House of Commons, which is far from a guaranteed thing, let's be clear. This is one poll. It's an encouraging poll, you're quite right, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Ed Miliband led in the polls, often in double digits for ages between 2010 and 2015, and we all know what happened there.
And I'd like to know what you think about this. Do you believe that poll is more to do with Labour's success or the Conservatives' failures, especially in response to COVID-19?
Definitely the latter.
Definitely, easily. And we know how much that can be double-edged, because I think a lot of people saw the Brexit vote as a vote of no confidence in the Conservatives, rather than a vote of confidence for an independent Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely something that we need to be careful with.
Mm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
the thing about Boris, ironically, is that we were sort of talking about this on Twitter, weren't we, yesterday?
Oh,
Is
yes.
that while he was perhaps the right person to, win that majority and, the big blustering sort of speeches and all that, but actually when it comes down to it, when he's up against Keir Starmer, he's quite struggled, and perhaps he's not the right person to keep hold of that majority, in a way where other Conservative prime ministers were quite good at, really.
Mm.
I fully anticipate Boris Johnson's going to be gone within 18 months.
He's not the technocrat that they kind of need to say the right thing at the right time. Yes, you're right. He was very good at saying get Brexit done, get Brexit done, get Brexit done as often as possible. But yeah, when it comes to the actual governing of things, he does look very much out of his depth.
Agreed.
The question is, how many people are actually watching? Like the PMQ sessions where everyone's slamming at him, he's just sitting like playing Doodle Jump on his phone.
Mm.
How much of this is actually in the public consciousness?
That's a good point. Yeah, I think not as much as it should be. Obviously, Labour are trying to get it there, but how many people tune in every week? Yeah,
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and I'm going to say actually the political engagement is higher than it probably ever has been. COVID has really brought government decisions to the forefront of our minds. We all sit and think, oh no, the prime minister's announcing measures to do with social distancing or closing things or lockdowns or whatever. So I think there is more engagement, I think, now than there used to be, perhaps even at the height of the Brexit debate, when everybody was just kind of turned off, plague on both of your houses.
Yeah. We'll have to see whether the COVID crisis is finally able to sort of repair the gap in voter turnout that was sort of created under Blair, because none of the previous elections have managed to do that.
That's true, but we haven't had a centrist Labour leader for a while, not since Ed Miliband, and I firmly believe that the only way that Labour is going to win back power is from the centre. There are so many of these seats in the north of England, particularly, that went Conservative at the last election, who, in my opinion, have absolutely no place being led by a Conservative with working class communities with completely different set of values. Labour need to work on getting those seats back. And then that's where their route to power comes from.
I'm going to disagree slightly there. I'm not so sure it's a matter of leading from the centre as a matter of making sure it's a broad coalition.
Sure. I agree. And I think, when Corbyn was in power, was leading the Labour Party, he didn't offer enough to the centre. And I think Starmer would do well by consolidating the centre and offering an olive branch to the left as well, because I was just going to say that the Conservatives have an inherent advantage. There are definite factions of the Conservative Party as well, but they, in my opinion, are much better at not fighting with themselves when it matters. Yes. When there's an election on, when they need to get back into power, they're very good at keeping quiet on issues when they need to keep quiet, and talking about issues when they need to talk about them. And they also don't have another part, UKIP, Brexit Party, etc. electorally not particularly relevant, in my opinion. But on the left, there's the Lib Dems, there's the SNP in Scotland, there's Plaid in Wales, the Greens, and all of these other parties have to also be brought up into a kind of progressive tent, in my opinion, to be able to try to win back power for the progressives in the left end, in the left coalition.
Trouble is, at the moment, I don't think Labour is, and to be honest, I think rightly, I don't think Labour is prepared to concede to just being part of this alliance.
Not yet. We have 4.5 years to go, or 4 years to go. But again, I think it would be electorally intelligent to do it. We can have the ideological arguments after power is achieved. If you want to make change, you have to be in power to do it, and so that has to be, in my opinion, the first step before you worry about your ideology in that sense. But maybe I'm a heathen as far as that's concerned, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we need to look at is Keir Starmer's speech at the virtual Labour conference, which, we're talking about the issue of winning back voters from parts of the country like the north. I mean, that was in Doncaster, and as Keir Starmer alluded to, the first Labour leader speech in Yorkshire since Harold Wilson. And I think for me, more significantly, was the fact that it was Ruth Smeeth who was the former Stoke-on-Trent North MP, who actually introduced him. Of course, that was a constituency which has never returned a Conservative MP. And that seems very much an olive branch to those voters to say, we want you back. So what did you make of Keir's speech? What did we think of it?
Well, that's also a double-edged sword with her introducing him, though, insofar as they could say, we've got a loser here.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get that vibe from it. I mean, I see what you're saying now. It could be like that, but I think it was more about...
That's not my personal take. I'm parroting what somebody said to me, what their take was on it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, it seemed more like a process of rebuilding to say, this constituency has never had a Conservative MP. I can't believe we've got one now. This is what it almost should have been. Whether that's rightly or wrongly, I'm not sure. But yeah, what do we make of the speech anyway about what Keir said at the virtual Labour conference?
Look, I think there's one point that needs to be made is that Keir Starmer is still being very vague on policy, which I think worked to him to start with. But I don't know how many people watched that Gogglebox where people were reacting to his interview on Andrew Marr, where they were all saying, but we want to know what you would do rather than just criticising what the government's doing.
Yes, I completely agree with that. But also, I wonder if he's being electorally smart about this. It's 4 years before we go to the polls. And any policy initiative that he announces now, not going to be enacted, and people won't remember it in 4 years' time. At the moment, we're in an unprecedented situation with COVID-19. The government are having to deal with certain circumstances that no other government have had to deal with since the Second World War. And inevitably, a government of any stripe would struggle in certain ways. I believe this government is doing some fundamentally making horrendous decisions about this. But I think it is most intelligent from Keir Starmer to simply say the Conservatives are screwing up for these reasons. I'll tell you what I'm going to do later down the line. And if he can keep his parliamentary party in order and not have any challenges, then I think it sets him up nicely for the 2024 election.
I have to say, though, just on that point, and I think that's a valid point, that Keir Starmer not introducing policy now is perhaps a good strategy. However, I do have to say, I think there are a lot of people in this country who need something to hold on to hope to. I mean, look at, for example, the austerity measures that we had, which cut, for example, things like, disability allowance, which cut heating allowance, which a lot of people have suffered with. I think to not introduce measures now or ideas specifically to look at those issues, I think a lot of people in the Labour Party, a lot of Labour voters are going to be disappointed by that. And that's something the Labour Party have to think about.
It's worth bearing in mind that a lot of people, after Ed Miliband's defeat in the 2015 election, one of the biggest reasons cited for people leaving Labour was that Labour didn't seem to be offering an alternative.
It's difficult with the media situation as well. Any policy initiative that Labour introduce, the Daily Mail and the Sun are not going to like. Even if it is the best policy initiative under the sun, even if it's incredibly popular, I guarantee that Rupert Murdoch is not going to give the Labour Party the platform that they need to sell this to the parts of the electorate. I mentioned last episode that I work part-time at the moment in a supermarket because of the COVID crisis, and it's in a relatively working class area, a council estate, and you'd be surprised the percentage of Suns and Daily Mails I sell. So these are the voters that Labour need to win back, and I think Labour are aware that the newspapers are not going to be favourable to them. So it's important, I think, to try to stay as close as they can until the election rolls around, and then go for power when the time comes.
I do think, though, that some of the prescriptions that have been nailed down from Starmer have been rightly criticised. The idea that children should be back in school, which he put forward, I think, far too early, and also against the advice of the teachers' union. I think that's a big blow against him, and because we're not seeing a lot of other positions from him, that's the main thing that's one of the main things that's on the public consciousness when his name gets brought up. He allowed the COVID crisis to get worse, even if he's not in a properly powerful position to influence it.
Especially if down the line, Boris Johnson's not leading the Tories into the next election, and you might have a Tory leader who'll disown what Boris Johnson did, and then bring that back against Starmer.
Yes, Rishi Sunak could be could be prime minister in 4 years' time, given that he's by far the most popular Conservative politician at the moment. Yes, absolutely. And I also think there's something to be said for the fact that he is still from London. I think it's harder for working class voters to relate to him more quickly. But then again, I think a smart electoral strategy, is to look to the north. I think the votes in Islington are going to be there regardless.
Labour hasn't had a northern leader since Harold Wilson. Let that settle in.
Well, I suppose you could call Tony Blair northern, given that he had a northern constituency and that he was born in Scotland. But yes, I take your point.
I mean, Ed Miliband had a northern constituency too.
Yes, yes, he does. That's very yes, of course. But I do take your point.
One thing which was quite interesting for me when I listened to Keir Starmer's speech was the emphasis on community, the emphasis on building a country that works for young people, for old people, for everybody. And I just kind of feel that if I had closed my eyes and heard that speech or seen it written down, I wouldn't necessarily assume it was a speech given by a Labour leader. I actually don't think there was much specific Labour-esque in that speech, and it could have easily been from another party, just based on what we were saying about, not pushing on policy.
Obviously, the Labour needs to appeal and reach out to people on the other side of the aisle and appeal to people who have voted Conservative in the past. At the same time, there's a difference between reaching across the aisle to them and pandering to them.
Yeah, Tory light is perhaps not the best way to go either. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, all right then. So yeah, we've had a look at about Labour's election. Let's move on slightly now. We're going to look at regional governance in different areas of the UK. This is an issue which has never really gone away and perhaps is even more important now than ever before. With coronavirus, it's vital that different regions in England have the ability to control it as they see needs to be done. Do we think the UK is a extremely divided country regionally?
In some respects, yes. But then, if we're talking about the coronavirus in general, it's the same. It's the same battle we're all waging. So we do have the potential to be united on this. But yeah, you are right. There are flare-ups in particular parts of the country. Local lockdowns, especially here in the north, do require northern leadership, and sometimes it can be difficult if that governance is coming from somewhere that's further away.
Yes.
Well, I think one of the big problems going back in terms of the origins of a lot of the problems in regional governments is the move away from a manufacturing-based economy and more towards financial services, especially in London, where we just so completely centralised our economy around London has been a lot of the problem, and a lot of regions have been left behind. And I think there does need to be more investment in the regions. And I think one of the best ways to achieve that is to have regional-led initiatives, such as, for example, we've seen recently the Greater Manchester Authority, with a figure such as Andy Burnham leading.
And a similar situation in Liverpool as well.
Yeah.
It's definitely interesting as a sort of slight outsider who moved here 10 years ago. If you take Australia as an example, there's no one centralized seat of power. I know Canberra's the capital, but there are a number of other large capital cities dotted around the place. Whereas in this country, there is a lot more power, centered in London, centered in the southeast. But I do think it's something that needs to be addressed, because there are large swathes of the population who live outside the M25 who have needs and also can vote, as we've seen in certain referenda recently.
Plus, it's worth bearing in mind with regions of England that they get less representation because we have the Scottish Parliament, we have the Welsh Parliament, and we have the Northern Irish Assembly. But, the Northwest isn't represented in a similar way. The Northeast isn't. The Midlands aren't. The Southwest isn't.
And despite being English, it doesn't. They don't always have their priorities aligned with London. Exactly. As other parts of the southeast. Yeah, I completely agree. The more devolved administrations there are, the better, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's an issue when you look at the population of these regions as well. We're talking about millions of people who really don't have a full, aren't fully represented. The fact that their MP goes down to London to vote, that's troubling for a lot of people, I believe. Do we see that as? Do we think the answer to that could be having, for example, I don't know, a regional assembly for each region, or a parliament for Northern England? What do we think about that?
I think.
Sorry.
No, you go.
Oh, you're too polite. I'd favour a method of regional assemblies rather than an English parliament, so to speak, or a Northern Parliament. I think even different regions within the North and the Midlands and the South have various problems of their own that I don't think a blanket English parliament would solve.
I'm going to make a slightly different suggestion and suggest that first past the post as an electoral system is one of the worst electoral systems you can have.
Well, yes.
And if you look at the devolved administrations, they're more proportionately represented with the way people vote. They're all slightly different, but the fact that you can win a seat and be sent to Westminster for 5 years on 30% of a vote or so, I mean, isn't really conducive to people being interested in politics and also feeling underrepresented. I think it's very, very difficult because FPP favours the Conservatives and Labour and nobody else, so that neither of them are going to be interested in introducing changes to the electoral system. And we know that the Lib Dems did have a referendum on it in 2011 and lost quite substantially. But I think if we were able to move to some form of proportional representation in Westminster, you would find in turn there would be more representation from the regions and from a wider range of political parties who would be forced to work together and forced to address their different priorities.
I've lived in 5 different constituencies in my adult life. Only one of them was a swing seat. That's one thing to bear in mind as well. A lot of voters who live in safe seats feel like, what's the point of my vote under first past the post?
That's another thing. And in Australia, voting is compulsory. And I wholeheartedly believe that it should be here. You don't have to vote in the sense that nobody hovers over you and makes sure that you tick a box with your little stubby pencil, but you do have to turn up and get your name ticked off, which I believe we as citizens have a responsibility to do that. Everybody have a sausage sizzle at the same time, so people will raise money for charities and local schools and things, calling it your democracy sausage while you wait. I think that could be another change if people were forced to vote. I think you'd have serious outcries from civil liberties groups, but again, that would be another solution, I think, to some of these problems.
It's an interesting one. I'm genuinely on the fence about compulsory voting. I'm very open to having my mind changed either way.
I've lived in both. I spent my childhood in New Zealand, but I reached, I moved to Australia when I was 15, and so obviously I cast my first ballot in the 2004 general election in Australia, which saw John Howard return to power. So and I've obviously lived here, and as a Commonwealth citizen, I'm entitled to vote here as well. So I've seen it live in both ways, and there is more political engagement in Australia as a result. People know they need to vote, and even if it's only a passing thing, people are forced to have at least a little bit of an idea.
Yeah, perhaps one issue, like, I don't know, how long has it been compulsory voting like that? Is it quite established, or?
I don't want any historians to comment below, but I do not know when it wasn't. I've only ever known voting to be compulsory in Australia at all levels, federal, state, and local level.
Because I'm just thinking, I know a lot of that. I was just thinking on that. If that's something quite established, it's sort of already there.
Yes,
that's a nice way to do it. Whereas I think over here, if we introduced that and suddenly said to a lot of people in the north who, for example, who maybe have never voted, to say you have to vote, that could also push people to perhaps more extreme parties, I think. So we've got to be really careful with that.
We do, but I think on a long-term basis, I think you'd see a realignment. Other small changes could be made. I mean, I was shocked when I moved to this country to see that you have elections on Thursdays. What are you doing having an election on a Thursday? I've got to go to work. Have an election on a Saturday. Yeah. And I appreciate that certain communities will have Sabbath and other things that they need to be doing on Saturdays, but that's why we have early polling. That's why we have postal votes. Just anything that you can do to engage the largest swathe of the electorate is good, in
Or
my
at least
opinion.
make election day a bank holiday.
Make election day a bank holiday.
I guess that's another big point, right? Because if you institute mandatory voting, then voter suppression becomes almost impossible.
Exactly.
Like it is something that exists to varying degrees in the UK. It's not as bad as the US, where you have armed militias standing outside polling stations, but it is still something that we need to be concerned with.
I agree.
Yeah, and of course, the thing is, the reason voting isn't compulsory here is because, let's face it, it benefits one party more than another. People who are the least likely to vote are young people. Also, the people who are most likely to vote for parties like the Labour Party, the Green Party, the SNP. So I think it's like, I don't think it's an accident we have it like this system. I think it's a very calculated approach, actually. And I think it could have been changed a long time ago, but hasn't deliberately.
And it's not just that. I mean, the gap between young people and old people in terms of how you're likely to vote is even more stark than ever. If you look at the graphs, I mean,
they're
look at 2019.
Almost diametrically opposite in terms of support for Labour over the Conservatives. I remember reading somewhere that the reason that the elections in America are on Tuesdays is because it's the Sabbath on a Sunday, and it takes you a day to travel by horse and cart to your local polling station, to vote on Tuesday, and then you have a day to get back for market day, which is Thursday. I mean, we live in the 21st century, so the reasons why these things are the way they are, are fairly archaic. I'm sure there's a similar I do not know why we have elections on Thursdays in this country, but it's probably for a similarly silly reason.
Indeed. Of course, when we're talking about regional inequality, I think it is fair to look at both sides of the argument and say that it's not a case of, for example, the North is a totally deprived region, because there are extremely wealthy parts of the North. There are extremely poor parts of London. I think we have to look at those sides of it too.
And the rest of the South, I will stand for the Southwest as I live here.
Yeah, indeed. One thing we have to look at, though, is how connected the country is. And by that, I mean travel. Do we know the cost of a train ticket from Manchester to London?
It's about, well, I mean, I did that trip not too long ago, and even with my 26 to 30 rail card, yes, that was a moment, going from the 16 to 25 to the 26 to 30. But yeah, it was about 70 quid.
It's more expensive than that, even as a proper full-blown adult like I am. In a previous life, my job involved a lot of travel, and I was frequently on the Manchester to London train, and sometimes it was cheaper to fly, and it's pretty outrageous that I can part with a sum of three figures to try to get between Manchester and London. Peak, I think a peak train ticket from Manchester to London in first class is just shy of 500 quid. And I appreciate we don't all sit in first class, but that just goes to show.
Which is essentially what, a 2-hour journey?
Yeah, 2 hours and 8 minutes. Yeah. Unbelievable.
I mean, I on that trip when I was doing I think it was a similar trip I did recently, well, about a year ago now. I did a trip from Bristol to Manchester, and then getting from Manchester to Wigan. Cool. You should have seen the difference of the train I was on, which is a relatively modern train going up the country. Then you should have seen the old banger of a thing I was taking between Manchester and Wigan.
Northern Rail, any chance?
You guessed it.
Yeah, I've been on that train many times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but that's a big thing, and I think as I'm from Manchester, that's something which for me has always been quite a thing. Whenever I had to take the train in the north, I always found it to be a very unpleasant experience, to be honest, on old trains which were rammed full of people, which were very often delayed, and something really simple which bugs me. I live in London now because I'm studying my news associates course, and the fact that I'm here, when you're on a bus here, it announces the stops. It says like, the next stop is here, the next stop is there. Some of them even have like a TV screen, and you can see where you are, where the next stop is, which sounds simple, but that's so useful. Whereas in Manchester, when I'm taking the bus to town, there's no mention of the stops or anything like that. So I always just think, if you're not from there, how would you know where you're getting off? How do you know where you're going? And that kind of really simple solutions to things like that really affects businesses who want to come there, because if you're coming from somewhere like, I don't know, if you're from India and you want to start a business here and you've got no idea how to get around the city, that's going to impact you. So really simple things.
Yeah. I mean, if you go anywhere even remotely rural, I mean, I was covering this recently because I've been a local journalist in Dorset for a while. There was a study out from the CPRE, the Campaign to Protect Rural England, recently that listed numerous small towns across the country as being what they call transport deserts, where there's basically no serious access to public transport for various places. That's a real problem that's affecting regions both in the southwest, where I've been, and in the north as well. And there aren't enough people who care to do anything about it.
It's a problem that needs to be fixed. And I guess, unfortunately, there aren't enough people that it affects to make it electorally smart to do. I'm not talking about in central Manchester, but I'm talking about in rural Dorset when the bus to town comes on Thursday. I know, that kind of thing. I agree that something needs to be done to fix it. I wish I knew the answer.
Yeah, I used to live in Europe, and I remember taking trains in the Czech Republic and Spain. I've lived, and travel is so cheap there. In the Czech Republic, it costs nothing. It costs like a couple of quid, and you can travel for essentially what is an hour or an hour and a half journey. Not much faster than the journey from London to Manchester, and it cost almost nothing. Great quality trains. I think it doesn't have to be like this. Transport in this country.
To bring it back to a key policy issue, I think one of the big moments is the privatization of the railways. I mean, we see a similar debate going on in the States at the moment about the privatization potentially of the United States Postal Service, and how a lot of people are saying that if that were to happen, more rural regions in the States might be cut off from their postal services because it's not profitable to deliver so often to those places. Whereas under the USPS, that service is there. And that's exactly what we've seen happen in this country when the rails were privatized. Yeah. London to Manchester is still a decent link, but try going, say, from, well, like I pointed to, I mean, even Wigan's hardly out in the sticks, but, the rail services in rural regions are not good.
No, transport is not a situation where you should be thinking about making profit. People need to come first, in my opinion.
Yep. Moving on a little bit to the north, we're going to stick to this topic, but which countries around the world do we think that the UK could learn from in terms of balancing regional division?
Germany would be one, I think, although that is a full-on federal system, and I'm not sure I'd necessarily advocate for federalism in the UK. I think I'd probably be more in favour of devolution, but at the same time, you have your regional assemblies in Germany, plus you get, with their electoral system, you have constituency seats and you have a separate lot of list MPs that are proportionally elected. And I think that's the sort of system we should be looking at in the UK.
Similarly in New Zealand, who have their general election in 3 weeks' time. They have a thing called mixed member proportional representation, whereby every person gets 2 votes, one for a constituency MP, and 1 vote for a party. So you can split your ticket if you like, and any party who receives more than 5% of the total party vote gets a certain number of MPs in Parliament, and that that leads to coalitions. And that leads to a broader spectrum in our one chamber that we have. I
mean, I pointed to alternate countries like Germany as an example of that system. We have it here in the UK. We have it in the London Assembly, and we have it in the Scottish Parliament.
Indeed, but there's just not going to be the political will from Westminster to change these sorts of things, unfortunately.
No, and it's the same as reducing the number of MPs, for example, which is something I'd be in favour of. But it's turkeys voting for Christmas if you try to get that through Westminster.
Indeed, and I think when you talk about Germany, I think anything that is going on inside the EU at the moment, the Conservative Party aren't even going to look at as an option, as whether it's good or not, whether it could be the best idea ever. You see it when in the COVID-19 response. Germany has a similar sized population to the UK, similar sized population density. I know that the numbers aren't exactly right, but similar. And people are saying, why has Germany got its track and trace system up and running properly, etc., etc. And people just aren't, the Conservative Party aren't willing to engage with that because, well, that's just an EU country, isn't it?
We weren't even willing to copy the open source contact tracing apps that were made available by other national governments.
I know, outrageous.
I think, has anyone seen the new season of Rick and Morty at all?
No, I'm afraid not.
Where there's an episode where Rick has a sort of intern alien that keeps on asking people to develop an app, and he has "Do not develop my app" tattooed on his forehead. I think that's what we need to put on Matt Hancock's forehead.
I think we need to put a lot of things on Matt Hancock's forehead. I'm not sure that tattoo would be the first thing I'd want to put on his forehead, but that's just me.
I believe I was listening to a podcast about apps the other day, and I believe Matt Hancock actually developed his own app not too long ago, but there were problems with it because, when you download an app and it needs permissions to do things. So the app was called the Matt Hancock app. So what happened was that it would say Matt Hancock wants permission to view your photos. Which
oh boy,
many people would click no to. Yeah.
I mean, half of my the photos on my phone are just memes, so he can knock himself out as far as I'm concerned.
I'm pretty sure half the photos on my phone are like weird screen caps from Duolingo as I try and very poorly to learn Esperanto. Beautiful language.
Indeed.
Okay. This seems like a nice point to move on to our other topic today, which is the issue of eco-fascism around the world. And for this one, I'm gonna go over to Mason and ask if you can introduce the topic to us as it is at the moment.
Okay. So, introducing eco-fascism as it exists right now, and not like how it might change in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. So. The broad, as is always the case in discussions around fascism, there are a lot of different academic consensuses on what the definition is or should be. But by and large, eco-fascism is sort of a ecological wing of fascist theory that believes that, the people are subservient to the land. We can see traces of this in the original Nazi movement. Blood and soil was one of their most famous and most reused chants since, because the idea is that, the land, the physical territory, is more important than the people living on it. It can also describe the way that sort of violent authoritarianism can creep into more mainstream ecological discourse. This is something that we've seen with Extinction Rebellion. One slogan that they put out during the COVID-19 crisis is that humans are the virus. And that's, I think, a very worrying line of rhetoric because, if you say humans are the virus, what are you saying is the cure? So probably the most mainstream wing of what would be called academically eco-fascist discourse is the fear around overpopulation. The idea that there are too many humans and that whether or not you're willing to say it, we need to do something to either stop people making more of them or to get rid of some of the surplus that we have.
Thanks,
obviously,
Mason,
it's sort of, and obviously down the line, if you were to get, God forbid, another Hitler who'd come along and say, people from the developed world, read between the lines as to what the dog whistle is there, they're overpopulating, they're breeding, we need to sort this out. It's not difficult to see where that could lead. And it's quite scary to think.
Yeah. What do we think about groups like Extinction Rebellion? I mean, they're very active in the UK. There were recent protests across major cities where transport was disrupted. Airports in particular are targets. However, there have also been targets for things like public transport systems, like the tube, like buses. Is that the right approach to raising issues about the environment, to target commuters?
I think it's very important to raise these issues into the public discourse, but I think it's also really important to do them in a way that is going to be effective. And so you're right. If you want to talk about carbon emissions, targeting public transport networks, probably not the smartest way to do it. And if you want people in power to take notice of you, you need to do it in such a way that's going to disrupt them and perhaps make the people that will otherwise vote for them want to talk to their elected representatives to try to bring change.
I don't think it sets a good precedent that a lot of people's, like main interaction with the climate movement is, oh, those are the wankers who made me late for work.
Well, yes.
Yeah. And
I got shouted at by my boss because of that.
I got
And
docked.
they did a die-in or whatever they do.
I got docked my pay because of then, and now I can't afford to take my kid to the movies on the weekend.
I was late to pick up my kid from school because of it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think these sorts of people probably need to think about target their strategies a bit better, and try and figure out who the people are that they want to change the minds of, and have them help do their work for them.
Yeah, I mean, just that said, on the other side of the argument, in terms of climate now, we are at possibly one of the most dangerous periods that's ever been, in terms of how pressing the issue is. We're already seeing the change that happens. There is an argument that more aggressive measures need to be taken to make sure people are taking notice of this, because, to be honest, a lot of people still aren't. A lot of people still deny what's happening around the world. What do we make of that argument that actually aggressive measures like shutting down cities or even worse are actually needed to raise awareness of this?
Well, that's exactly the point I was trying to get to, is it's terrifying to think what those stronger measures may be if we have somebody from the reactionary right who does believe in climate change, what sort of policies they may introduce. I mean, we've seen some early forms of this already, the Christchurch mosque shooter for one.
Yeah. He very much referred to eco-fascist rhetoric and iconography in his manifesto. And I think that this is one of the main reasons why we're having this discussion. Because as horrendous and misplaced as it is, the eco-fascists are visibly attempting to do something about the climate, while neoliberalism is sort of just twiddling its thumbs. And I think that the proper solution to that is an actual left movement, in order to try and achieve a better version of those goals.
And at the moment, because of figures like Trump in the US and others, Bolsonaro in Brazil, etc., you've got a platform for some of these ultra right wingers who don't believe in climate change at all. Even 5 years ago, you had a bit more of at least climate change acceptance on the right. So I think in some ways the problem is worse than it was even 5 years ago.
So if I'm going to like point to like what I think the good cases of climate activism were, I'm going to point to the Wet'suwet'en people of Canada and the gas-linked pipeline that they were protesting against. Their methods were to protest on the building sites of oil extraction and pipelines, and to protest the transportation infrastructure that was bringing in supplies for that construction, but not, the transportation for people who needed to get to work. I think that's an important distinction. The largest amount of harm done to the climate is done not by individual consumers, but by industry. And those are the groups we need to target. And those are the groups that are going to feel the sting and put pressure on policymakers.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there when you say we place too much emphasis on the individual as to how to target climate change. They say sort of get an electric car, go vegan, etc. That's not going to be enough. There needs to be definite government action. And like I say, it's scary to think what that government could look like if it goes into the wrong hands.
Yeah, you can't tell a working class person to buy an electric car when we haven't made any real efforts to invest in electric car infrastructure for charging them, maintaining them, or even making them like readily purchasable
and affordable.
Yeah. I think very much the same issue goes for cycling infrastructure too. As I live in London now, I live in a part of the city which is actually very good for cycling, but it's the first time in my life really that I've lived in a city with good cycling infrastructure, where you can actually go to the shops, where you can go to the park, and you're not battling with cars, you're not battling with abuse, which, to be honest, in other cities I've experienced.
We saw it a very interesting scenario in Manchester, just near where I live, quite recently, on the A56, where with COVID and the lockdown, obviously there was less traffic on the road. So the council just said, right, okay, well, we're just going to use this opportunity to put a cycle lane in. Now, and reduce the main busy road from 2 lanes down to 1. Now, that made perfect sense during lockdown. But once cars started returning to the roads, all it did was just choke up the roads. So it's important, obviously, to have somewhere for cyclists to cycle safely and to encourage more people to do it. But similarly, you can't do it at the expense of other users of transportation, at least not at the beginning. So yeah, I wonder where the answer lies. You've got scenarios where local governments are saying we're going to introduce congestion charges here, we're going to introduce high emission vehicles charges there. It's all well and good charging for the bad behavior or the dirty behavior, but the other thing is you've got to do it you've got to incentivize the lower end of it as well. So I think there's a delicate balancing act that needs to go on.
Yes, indeed. And how do we see people getting involved in eco-fascism? Why does someone choose to go to a group that describes itself as eco-fascist with really extreme measures rather than look at something like, for example, the Green Party, or look at the environmental wings of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party? How does that happen?
I mean, if I were to give my speculation on it, I would say that the people populating this movement are largely lonely white men. To sort of point back for, I think, the third time in as many podcast episodes, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, 3 decades ago, or was it I think it was in the 80s, actually. I think he was caught in the 90s. But, lived in a cabin in the woods, crawled out every couple of years to throw a bomb at a random corporation he thought was destroying the planet. And that was the extent of his interaction with society. And that sort of primitivist mindset, that sort of anti-industrial mindset, I think appeals very much to people who feel lonely and alienated from very urbanized, very globalized world. They want something where they can sort of have a larger personal space, even if that means having to build your own log cabin.
And the internet's made sort of far-right recruiting so much easier with things like 4chan message boards.
Oh, yeah.
And YouTube algorithms.
Kaczynski had to send in bombs to newspapers to get them to print his manifesto. Nowadays, he could upload it to Dropbox and HM be spreading it about within an hour.
Yeah, and it's still on. I mean, it's very accessible, isn't it? It's still on the internet. You can just download it and read it. And I do wonder if that's a good idea. I'm not sure.
You might end up on a watch list if you did.
Yeah.
I mean, I've looked at his manifesto myself. I'm unimpressed. What it says to me is basically that the rhetoric of these people has changed absolutely not at all over 3 decades. All the way back in his manifesto against industrialization, Kaczynski was writing, the problem with the left is that they have diversity hiring quotas for black people, and this upsets me. Also, lefties are too sensitive and emotional.
Mason, I know you were bringing this up before the podcast. Do you think this goes back further than 3 decades, and we're looking back to Malthusian theory? Do you want to explain to us what that is?
Yeah. So Malthus, for once, not a German, English, wrote about the French Revolution and the period of starvation that followed. His belief was that, overpopulation is an issue because people breed faster than they are capable of increasing their food production. And the issue is that this has been more or less disproven by every historical event since the time he was writing it. We are actually using less agricultural land today to produce higher amounts of food because the technology is continuously getting better. We're getting better at creating machinery in order to harvest large amounts of food. We're getting better at producing fertilizer that allows us to extract more from the land. All of that has managed to very effectively outpace the rate at which we are creating more humans. And then as countries have developed and achieved better levels of education and urbanization, people have fewer children, and thus, the population sort of caps out at a certain point. So it's not going to be like Malthus speculated, where we just sort of breed ourselves to death. That's the rhetoric that was used to justify denying food to people in Ireland and in Bengal during periods of massive famines in those regions. And in fact, was used to justify exporting food from those regions in order to cull the population through starvation.
Wasn't that what Winston Churchill said at the height of the Great Bengal Famine? He said it was the fault of Indians for breeding like rabbits. I believe that was the quote.
Exactly so.
Yeah.
So, I think that's solidarity we need. We need Irish-Indian solidarity, along with all of the other nations that have been denied food during famines under British rule.
That's a long list.
It is a long list.
Okay. So we've been recording for a while now. Thank you very much for your thoughts today, guys. Before we wrap it all up, I just want to ask, do you have any final thoughts on anything we've spoken about today, be that the American election, eco-fascism, anything final that you want to get off your chest?
Yes, I would like to lay out my idea that won't happen for electoral reform in this country.
Okay.
I would like to see, I did prepare this, I would like to see the number of MPs in the House of Commons slashed to 400. I would like the House of Lords to be abolished and replaced with a House of State, was my working name for it, in which each of the four home nations, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, each get about 50 representatives that are elected proportionally within those four nations. Within England, I would like to see regional assemblies in each region with a regional capital and a roughly number of assembly ministers relative to the size of the population that's responsible for things along the lines of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. There you have it.
I'd vote for that.
Oh, and plus the House of Commons, 300 constituency MPs and 100 proportionally represented.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah, good ideas.
In terms of the US election, watch this space. There's so much unknown at the moment. I know I've talked about the polls staying relatively stable, but we're definitely reaching a bit of a crescendo here. I think, with the Supreme Court nomination, with the debates coming up, I think there's going to be a lot more to talk about.
And I would add a final point on the discussion of eco-fascism. It's going to become more and more popular over the coming years as the climate crisis gets worse, as refugees are driven into Europe by increasing desertification in northern Africa, as sea levels rise, and some of the more I don't know if I'd call it fear-mongering speculation suggests the potential for so-called climate wars as we employ technology to sort of alter different areas of the Earth's climate that would have knock-on repercussions hurting other areas of the climate. The famous example is called iron salting. It's the idea that if you dump iron dust into the ocean, it'll cause massive algal blooms, soak up lots of carbon dioxide, also create massive poisonous spews that'll kill off all coastal life.
Of course, a lot of the world's most populous cities are coastal cities. If you look at places like Shanghai, Hong Kong, Miami, New York.
Yeah, but it's going to be the smaller fishing communities that are going to be completely wiped out by any such intervention.
But as our good old mate Ben Shapiro says, you just sell your house and move inland, don't you? Simple as that.
We should really invite him on. His name pops up regular on this podcast, so I think it's fair to give him a say.
Yeah, Ben, if you're listening,
it's just so much fun dunking on Ben Shapiro.
He makes it so easy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's say that all the leftists are going to sink in the water during the climate crisis. Let's say all that happens.
There you go. So if you've listened all the way through this episode, that's worth it just for that Ben Shapiro impression.
The leftists are going to come into your homes, going to want to gun at your kids, tell them they have to be leftists.
Okay, well, I think that just about brings us to an end. Just before we finish, I'll just plug one more time. Please do check out our event, our live stream event for the US election. That's going to be Tuesday, November 3rd. It's also James's birthday. And of course, please donate any money that you can to Safe Passage, who we're raising money for. It will be greatly appreciated. All the details can be found on our social media feeds, Twitter or Facebook or Instagram too.
Link to the fundraiser in the description.
Indeed.
Yep. Go and check it out. Okay, so on behalf of Richard, Mason, James, and myself, thank you very much for listening to the Redaction Politics Podcast. And this is goodbye. See you next time.
Take care.